Thank you, and now I'd like to welcome to the stage the distinguished panel and Jackson Taylor, their moderator, to talk about our subject today. Thank you.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jackson Taylor, and I've been directing the prison writing program at Penn American Center for over 20 years. And when I started the program, there were, at that time, 1.7 million people in prison. And I knew that by doing our writing program, whereby we offer an annual writing contest that prisoners can enter and send their manuscripts. We also send a handbook, which looks like this, free of charge to any incarcerated man or woman in the country who writes to us for it. And we also do mentoring pairings for people whose work has showed promise in the contest. And currently we did this, well, this year we will have done about 200 pairings this year alone. So that has grown and blossomed. And now the bad news is, I thought, doing all of that, we're going to bring that number down from 1.7 to 1.5, maybe, knock a couple 100,000 off. Didn't happen. And I heard that the new figure is 2.7. So we're going backwards even as we go forward. So I want to just explain briefly a little bit about how the panel is going to work. I've asked each of our panelists to speak to you for about 10 minutes. I will introduce each one before they speak, and then we'll bring some questions around to them, following up on what they've said. And at the end, then we'll open the floor to questions, and I hope that you will come forward with some of your thoughts and ideas that you would like to hear the group here, who's quite distinguished in every way, expound on. So let me begin by introducing Michelle Alexander, who is right here. She's an associate professor of law at Ohio State University, and she has litigated numerous class action discrimination cases. And she's also served as director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU of Northern California. Now, Michelle has just published an extraordinary new book, which is going to be for sale in the lobby afterwards, and it's called The New Jim Crow. And if you want to educate yourself about the industry of prison and what is going on in our country, I can't recommend this book to you highly enough. Some of you might have noticed the distinguished literary critic Daryl Pinckney, who praised the book highly in the New York Review of Books. And he liked it so much, he went to the editor and said it wasn't really assigned to him. He said, could I write about this book at the end of another review? So that gives you some idea of how important this book is. Now, Michelle argues that racial discrimination in the United States continues in a systematic way. Despite the perceived and maybe real gains of civil rights. And she also believes that the courts and the prisons play an active role in isolating a whole segment of our population. So without further ado, Michelle Alexander.
It's wonderful to be here and in the company of a group of brilliant writers and thinkers dedicated to challenging and engaging more deeply with the ways in which we interpret and understand our world, and in particular, our prison system. The title of today's panel, American Exile, the prison industry, I think joins together two concepts that are essential to understanding the nature of mass incarceration today. The concept of exile and industry, the concepts of social excommunication and financial gain. These concepts are critical to any understanding of how we have become the world's leader in imprisonment in the United States. Yet, I believe that it is impossible to fully appreciate the nature of mass incarceration today without an honest discussion about the role race has played in the birth of this system. Hence the title of my book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The title of the book, to a large extent, speaks for itself. I argue that today, in the so-called era of colorblindness, and yes, even in the age of Obama, a racial caste system is alive and well in America. The mass incarceration of poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, is tantamount to a new caste system when specifically designed to address the social, political, and economic challenges of our time. It's the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk. There was a time when I resisted comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing that the people who made those kinds of claims were engaging in exaggerations, distortions, or hyperbole. I actually thought that people who made those kinds of comparisons were doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and to achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of working as a civil rights lawyer on issues of racial profiling, police brutality, investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people released from prison, quote unquote, re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is so obvious to me now that what seems odd in retrospect is that I had been blind to it for so long. I describe my basic thesis in the introduction to the book where I write, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it." Now, here are a few of the facts that I uncovered in the course of my work and research that I describe in the book. There are more African American adults under correctional control today in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that deny the right to vote explicitly on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests kept black folks from the polls. But today, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. And in some major urban areas, more than half of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in 2002, it was reported that in the Chicago area, if you take into account prisoners, who are, of course, excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment, official unemployment statistics, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. But if you take into account prisoners, it was reported in 2002 that nearly 80% of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. But these men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race who are relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people that I think that mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, people generally react with shocked disbelief. They say, well, how can you say that? Now, our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. If black people would just stop committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being rounded up, locked in cages, and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime rates. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our prison population has quintupled in the space of a few short decades for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime. We went from a prison population in the mid-1970s of around 300,000 to now well over 2 million. But during that period of time, during those years, crime rates fluctuated. Went up, went down. Today, as bad as they are in many parts of the country, crime rates are at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, particularly black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this sudden, extraordinary explosion in black imprisonment, if not crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. In fact, drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, account for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of the most dramatic expansion of the prison system. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the war on drugs has made to mass incarceration, consider this: there are more people in prison and jail today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Not by accident. This drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have shown now for decades consistently that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Now, that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who a drug dealer is, as a black kid standing on the street corner with his pants hanging down. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. In fact, many of these studies indicate that where any significant differences in the data can be found, it frequently suggests that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. And when they're released, they are ushered into a permanent second-class status, a parallel social universe in which the very rights supposedly won during the civil rights movement no longer apply to them. So I hope that in our Q&A we'll have a chance to discuss what we do about this, because I believe nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Thank you very much.
to introduce you to John Lonergan. John has worked in many Irish prisons and institutions, and he has run Ireland's largest prison, Mountjoy, for an extraordinary number of years. He has introduced certain changes to the Irish prisons, and he has experience working with Irish political prisoners as well. He maintains that if people become aware of their own humanity, they are more likely to treat others with respect. And he's also convinced that every human being has the capacity to change, and that there's good and there's bad in all of us. John?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It is an honour as well for me to be invited over from Ireland and to share my experience of about 42 years that I worked in prison, or was in prison. And I'm just going to share as best I can in about 10 minutes, which is an impossibility, but at least I'll give you some outline of where I'm coming from. So I worked in the system, but I probably was and still am the biggest critic of the system in Ireland. So that's a sort of a contradiction. And it came about because when I started off in prison in 1968, we had, like America, except the countries that are tiny in Ireland versus America, we had 600 prisoners in Ireland, and when I left we had 4,600. So in my period, I saw an amazing increase in numbers. I went into prison. One of the things I'm going to say to you is that unless you're directly connected in some way with prison life, you have no idea. But you're probably an expert, because the world is full of experts on prisons. It's amazing. A matter of fact, the further you remove from prisons, the greater your expertise. That is actually true. If you bring that subject about anybody, I guarantee you, prison, everyone has a solution. Why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And I found that very frustrating. Because people just didn't know. And the second little thing I'm going to say to you is, and I put this together myself over the years from experience and from just struggling with the system, in the system, was what's popular is seldom right, and what's right is seldom popular. And if you go on popularity, you'll just flog them all and hang them all and just lock them all up. And that's what's popular, and I'm afraid politicians play for popularity. So they say the things that are popular, and we all say, yeah, do that. And so they do it. And they make a total bags of it. And they're never held to account, which is amazing. It's the one system that nobody ever says, listen, hold on a minute, it's failing, it's collapsing all around you, it's a disaster. No, you just keep going, lock more of them up, in worse and worse conditions. Other little point I want to make, that because Michelle mentioned it, and I just want to share it with you. When you think of poverty, don't just think of materialistic poverty. Because that's one of the great traps. Oh, they have no money, but they're getting social welfare payments or whatever. It's not about just money. Materialistic poverty is an element of it, but poverty has many, many connotations and consequences. Emotionally, psychologically, mentally, physically. And so it's right across the whole spectrum. So the people I met when I went to prison first in 1968, I went like you. I had an expectation. They're the baddies, and all the goodies are outside. Then I got there, and I discovered that, they were quite a unique group of people, all right, but they were misfortunes, using Irish terminology, more misfortunes than they were bad people. They had psychiatric illness. 1 in every 4 had a history of being an inpatient in a psychiatric hospital. 40% had contact with the psychiatric services. And just to back up Michelle, lately I was asked by students, what's the biggest contributory factor to imprisonment in Ireland today? And I said 80% of people are in prison directly or indirectly as a result of addiction. Now that's drugs, and I included that alcohol, because in Ireland we still drink too much. And so when you look at that, anyway, that's just the raw material. And what I did say is, and I want to share with you, is you cannot enforce change on other people. Americans should know that better than anybody else. Because over the years, in many parts of the world, that was one of the things they tried to do. Force change on people, you can't do it. And so I learned that very early on, and I tried to do the opposite then. I tried to bring around change from inside the human being. And that's what I meant when I said you change the person from the inside out. And that's why I want to give a plug to the creative side of life, the creative education thing, because I know it works almost to a man and a woman in prison. Creative stuff, writing, drama, the arts, you name it. There's unlimited, untapped talent. One of the things I say about life is, which came home to me very strongly, would you prefer to be born with talent or with opportunity? Just think about it for a moment. If you had an option at birth to be a talented person with no opportunity, or to just have a limited talent but a great opportunity, which would you go for? And what I learned in life was that so many people that I met in prison were very, very talented, but they never had opportunity. So they never became aware of their talent, which meant that it was of no benefit to them. And by small little interventions, like creativity and things like that, they became aware of their talents, and that changed their lives. I did say, and I mean this, I met many people in prison who committed horrific crimes, but I never met an all-bad person in prison. An all-bad person. I met people who need to stay in prison for the rest of their lives because of the risk factor. But there was still humanity within them given the right opportunity. And by the way, I always leveled it off by saying, I never met an all-good person on the outside of prison. And I'm still looking. What sort of things work? I tried it, especially with women in prison. We were trying to mention women in prison as well, because they make up a tiny percentage the world over of the overall prison population. In Ireland, about 3%. In India, 4%. So in Ireland, we have less than 200 women in prison and 4,500 men. So that should be a debate in itself. How come? What are the contributory factors? But anyway, just with women, I did try to completely change the environment. There's no inhumanity like man's inhumanity to their fellow man or fellow human being. There's no. Anywhere there's inhumanity, everything is a disaster. Those who operate it, those who work in it, those who are the recipients of it, inhumanity destroys humanity. And if you haven't got humanity, you have nothing, I guarantee you. And so I'm a total opponent of brutality, of violence, and of inhumanity in prison. Matter of fact, I advocate the opposite. I say very strongly, it's the place where you should be nurturing humanity all the time. I do believe in the principle, as has been mentioned by Jackson, that if you can touch the humanity of another human being and nurture it, you're automatically changing that person. What do I mean by that? I mean that if that person is in contact with his own humanity, he's far more likely to identify and respect the humanity of other human beings. Because at the end of the day, I believe that that's what it should all be about. I couldn't let today go without mentioning another area, because we create the environments that create prisoners. No question about that. We blame the British. I mentioned this in the card coming up. In Ireland, for many years, we blamed the old Brits. It was all their fault. They imposed all this misfortune on us, Irish. And then they gave it over to us about nearly 100 years ago. And we've done a lot worse on ourselves. We've created a far more discriminatory society, a far more social status society, where we have all levels, and at the bottom, we have about 96% of people who end up in prison come from the lowest socioeconomic status. Isn't that amazing? And we created it ourselves by our housing policy. And so I'd say at the very core of the problem, if you want to solve it, you must look at housing. And a very close relation is education. Isn't it amazing that in prison, about 96% of Irish prisoners have left the education system before the legal age, which is 16. They're gone by the time of 15. So they're poorly educated. They come from very identifiable poor areas. They have no work record and no work skills. And they're naturally addicted. Addicted to what? Mainly to alcohol and drugs. And so now this is the raw material. And then when they leave prison, as Michelle said, what happens to them then? They go back to where they're comfortable. They go back home. And what are they at home? Nothing but crime. Isn't that an amazing sight? And I'm going to finish off with a sad story that I just was supposed to highlight, maybe for you, what I'm talking about. I retired just a year. I fought the system as hard as I could from within. They hated me for that. I had a lot of success, and it's all in 12 months. It's all erased away again, and that just tells you the way the system is so supportive of the system. But anyway, the little story to finish off. Just before I ended my time in prison, this elderly woman who was a member of staff at the women's prison was on duty one night with a trainee member of staff with her, and she went to the gate to take in a committal, a young woman who was being committed by the police. And when she met this woman and signed for her body, because that's what you do, certifying that you took over the body, she gave her a hug. And And then she processed her through the reception area, got to the room, gave her a cup of tea, and on the way back, the young member of staff said to her, "Hi, what the hell were you doing?" Giving her a hug. And she said, "You wouldn't understand." She said, 20 years ago, I nursed her as a baby. She was up in the old women's prison with her mum, because her mum was serving a prison sentence, and with her, she had her daughter, a little baby. And 20 years on, here she was, being committed in her own right, continuing on the cycle of misfortune, the cycle of no opportunity, the cycle of prison following generations. And so I suppose I'd be saying that if you want to change prison, you must change society. Where do you go in society? You go at the areas where the causes are. The main causes are in deprivation, poverty, and discrimination. Discriminating against the poor. And finishing on what I started with saying, you must oppose the popular thing when it's not right. And you must be advocates for the right thing, even though it will make you unpopular. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Susan Rosenberg. Susan is an American political activist, and she was involved with many radical movements of the 1960s and 70s, as probably many people who in this room might have been who were of a previous time. Susan, like myself, of course, Susan was sentenced to 58 years in prison on a weapons and explosive charge, and she spent 16 years in prison, during which time she became a poet, an author of other kinds of writing as well, and she also became an AIDS activist. She is a member of our prison committee of the prison writing program at Penn, and her sentence was commuted by President Bill Clinton on January 20th, 2001, his final day in office. Susan.
Thank you. Thanks to Penn for this panel and for all of the work. I'm glad that there's an ex-felon sitting here, because I think I was talking to somebody earlier who said that the only way that we can, or one of the only ways that we can look at and deal with some of the profound contradictions in our prison system is for ex-felons to say that they're felons, that they are people who have come out of prison. And so I'm going to start that process for me here and say I'm glad that there is one of us on the panel, and I know my esteemed colleague here is also a former political prisoner. I'm going to actually read some stuff from the book, but I just wrote a book. It's An American Radical Political Prisoner in My Own Country. And I want to read something that is, I think, going to underscore and talk to almost point by point what Michelle was talking about the prison system. I came out of the prison system seeing the conditions of poverty, race, gentrification, you name it, worse now than when I went into prison. And so for me, the experience of 16 years in prison was living in the most disenfranchised community and learning from that community, both the terrible things about that community, but also the incredible things about that community. And the one other thing before I read, I also want to say is that I think that we exile those 2.7 million people. It's easier for us to not know them, to not recognize them. And that part of the point, when the number is so big, it's almost unfathomable. You know, what does that mean? We're talking about 10 million people who are connected to the criminal justice system, 2.7 who are currently behind the wall. Each one of them is a person, and each one of them has a voice, and each one of them we have relegated to the most minority, irrelevant part of our society, and that's part of why I wrote this book. I'd like to read a little bit from it. It's a story of being in the DC jail. I spent almost 3 years in the District of Columbia jail, awaiting trial there with 5 other political people. And the District of Columbia jail is 6 blocks from the White House, and it holds 3,000 African Americans in it. And it was a very difficult and also incredible experience. So I'd like to read about that. Thank you so much. One night, after many days of overcrowding and out-of-control tempers, there was a shakedown. We heard the correctional officers, all 20 of them, marching down the hall leading to the block. Of all the conditions in the jail, the shakedowns were the most invasive, most enraging, and most irrational. Of course there were drugs. Dope hit the unit every week. Of course people made weapons. Of course there was contraband food from the kitchen. We saw the cops sell dope, and a weapon could be fashioned from an aluminum can from the commissary. The correctional officers would come suited up in combat gear, and each cell was hit one by one, and mine was always first. Having heard them well in advance of their actual arrival, I had already flushed my contraband coffee grinds, my big illegal item. "Step out," they ordered. I was handcuffed and told, "Spread." This meant facing the wall and stretching out my arms and legs. I was patted down and told to stand next to the door. 4 of them went in. They searched every single thing. They unscrewed the light bulb. They climbed on the top bunk, looked at the window. They went through every legal and personal paper one by one. They dragged the mattress onto the tier. They took shampoo and talcum powder and poured them out onto the mattress. They took scooped peanut butter from an old jar and smeared it on personal photographs. They uncuffed me, put me back inside, shut the door, and repeated the process in every cell down the line. Everyone was yelling. In the cells that hadn't been hit yet, women were standing and watching. The violence seemed to increase with each cell. And then they got to the last 3. They popped open the door and one of them roared, "Step out!" The woman inside was brushing her teeth. One of them stepped in and grabbed her. She spit out her mouthful of toothpaste and saliva on him. If they had waited 10 seconds, she would have stepped out on her own. But she was disobeying an order, so 4 of them began to beat her up with all the rest of us watching. This small woman fought back. Everyone was hollering and throwing things out of the window. An egg went flying and hit one of the guards. 4 of them dragged the woman up the stairs into the entrance to the block. The cops had bloodlust in their eyes. In the hall, they couldn't get the cuffs onto her because her fury matched theirs. Eventually, they overpowered her and carried her off. I had never before seen that level of brutality directed against a woman. We were all crying from anger, frustration, and fear. And yet, in the DC jail, it was almost normal. It was not extreme. A little more brutal than usual, but only a little. To administer by fear and control by terror was a tactic that was understood by the prisoners. It was a natural way of life, inside or outside. I cried because I didn't know how to resist that level of dehumanization. Amid the wreckage of my cell, I spotted a book of poetry on the floor. I found the well-known poem by Langston Hughes, Harlem, the one that begins, "What happens to a dream deferred?" I stood at my window, and in the pulsating silence, in the aftermath of what we had just been through, I read it at the top of my lungs. No one said anything. And then a single voice started singing, "Amazing Grace," and then another, and another, and another, until there were many voices. Everyone knew the words. It was a most beautiful rendition, the richest that I had ever heard. And as the sound rose and fell, I remembered hearing somewhere that that song had been written by a slaver, a ship captain, who experienced a dramatic conversion and later spoke out strongly against slavery. I once was lost, but now am found.
I want to also say about Susan's book, if you want to read an account of how it works and how it works on the psychology of the human being to be in prison on a day-by-day basis, that book is definitely important to read. Our final panelist, Shahrnush Parsipur, is an Iranian novelist who spent 4 years and 7 months of her life in Iranian prisons, and she later published a memoir called Prison Memoir. And it is about that experience. Now, her work, as far as I know, is still banned in Iran. Is that correct? Yes. And that's the novels, that's everything, right? Everything. And she is not able to live in her homeland anymore, and she lives here in exile in the United States. We're going to time her segment a little differently. She'd like to speak for 4 minutes, and then we have a translator who will read some of her work to you. So please, welcome.
Hello. I am Iranian American writer, not because I am American also. I am a very young woman at the age 65.
Can you hold it up just a little bit closer, a little higher? Thank you.
I am a very young woman at the age 65. And 5 years of this youngness has spent in prisons, different prisons. The reason, it's almost more than 100 years that the Iranians try hard to not be for a sheep. Sheep means S-H-E-E-P. Because traditionally in patriarchal system of Iran, it's a long time that the Iranians, the people of Iran, they are sheep in front of the masters. And so the system calls itself arbab rayati, it means masters and sheep. Now the people don't want to be the sheep. So it's one of the reasons that they were always in prison. And they struggle hard, and the government execute the people because they don't want to be a sheep, you know. And I was in prison without any reason, any accusation. I think the guardian of prison wanted to know that she's not like a real, very real sheep. Who is she? It was my problem, because I couldn't play the role of a sheep, and so they wanted to change it. And I was witness of execution of more than 1,000 people in my country. The majority of them were the leftists of Iran, and unfortunately the type of leftists that they hadn't any defender out of Iran. I mean the communists or the leftists of Iran, that they were not executed. They are the people that they depend to other countries. But the independent Iranian that they wanted to be leftists, and when I speak about leftists, it's not possible to calculate it, what's the form, because in my country, they never permit that we see what these people want, you know. Wherever they wanted to speak a little, they brought them to the prison and they killed them. Between these people, we can find the Mujahideen Khalq. I speak especially about these people because they have executed more than 10,000 of these people. And now 3,600 of these people are in Iraq. And they suffer a lot. You can help them really. Because it's not clear if they are communist or Muslim or leftist. They had never chance to show themselves as human beings. When they were a fetus in the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, they brought sorry. They were like a fetus in the womb of their mother, and they threw them out, and they called them, they asked them, run. And when they ran, they began to execute them. It's the reason that I am very angry, because I found that if these people had any chance to show themselves to people, they were really very leftist. They were in the middle of the political ideas. So this is the reason that I spoke and I wrote after discovering that I am a sheep and lesser than a sheep, because the men in this society are sheep and the women are lesser than sheep. So after prison, I wrote a book, Tuba and the Meaning of Night. It became famous. I wrote an article and I declared that, yes, I know that I am a cow. I changed it to cow because Mitra, the prophet, the god, Iranian god from ancient time, he has killed a cow, the cow of the sky. So I knew that as a woman in matriarchal system, more or less I was a cow. So now I want to change the skin. All the Iranians want to change their skin. They want to be human beings. 4 minutes? And this is the reason that I am here to speak with you, and I prefer that my friend, because my English is really weak, my friend Sarah Khalili, the translator of my book, Prison Memoir, she will read some part of my book for you, and it's enough, I think.
Tehran, Evin Prison, 1981. One night we were all lying down next to each other. The lights were out, but we were still talking, sharing random memories. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning when I thought I should take advantage of the late hour and go to the bathroom so that I could avoid the long lines in the morning. The prisoners were all lying down pressed against one another, but to my surprise, they were all awake. Total silence reigned over the unit. It was a strange scene. Contrary to all other times, there were no lines at the bathroom door. Instead, several prisoners had gathered round the heating radiator, and they were taking turns climbing up on top of it so that they could look out from the window set high in the wall. One of them was Iran, another a girl called Farzaneh. Both were monarchists. The others belonged to other groups. When I walked out of the bathroom, I saw Iran climb down from the radiator. She was shaking. Although we were not friends, she took me by the arm and whispered that the bodies of the executed prisoners had been laid out on one side of the courtyard. That night, starting at 11 o'clock, we had heard an ear-splitting noise every few minutes. One of the prisoners had explained that they were building a visitor's room and that the noise was from the steel beams being dropped to the ground. Just then, we heard the noise again, and Iran, who was in shock, started to shake even more. I asked, "What is this noise?" She said, "Heavy machine gun fire." I left the people who were again climbing up on the radiator, walked back to my room. I felt quite uneasy. That day, at about 2 in the afternoon, I had seen 2 girls leave the unit. They were very beautiful and looked alike. They were wearing shoes, and to avoid dirtying the ragged piece of carpeting on the unit floor, they moved towards the door on their knees. I had asked their names and their ages. Both were 17 and looked like twins. The image of their amiable faces had stayed in my mind. I had not seen them return. Now I was looking more carefully at the prisoners. They were drowned in silence, staring directly ahead. When I reached my room, Faride, who managed the room across the hall, was standing in the doorway. I asked her, "What is going on?" She said, "It's machine gun fire, heavy machine gun fire. Can't you hear it?" She explained that when they carried out mass executions, they used heavy machine guns, and this was the sound of the shower of bullets being fired. Then she said everyone was quiet so that they could count and hear the single shots. After each shower of bullets, a single shot was delivered to the head of each prisoner. The prisoners were counting the single shots. So far, they had counted more than 90. Now I too was drowned in deathly silence. Faride said, "Listen." I could hear the muffled sound of the single shots. Again, the image of the two girls flashed in my mind. I returned to my room and quickly retold all this to Gulshan and the others. The silence of death washed over our room as well. The noise that until then was supposed to be steel beams crashing to the ground took on a different meaning. We too started to count the single shots.
How America's prisons compare to the prisons of the rest of the world, or kind of give us an international look. Does that be something you could do?
Sure, I can say a few words about that, and then if anyone else wants to respond as well. You know, the United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even, you know, fairly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. For a while, China and Russia were, you know, tying us for rates of incarceration, but we pulled past them, you know, after we passed the 2 million mark, and as you mentioned before, we're now heading to the 3 million mark. But what's interesting, if you kind of take a look at rates of incarceration, you know, across countries, what you see is that not just in the United States, but in virtually every country around the world, crime rates and incarceration rates don't well follow one another. Rates of incarceration are largely disconnected from crime rates. The amount of punishment a country chooses to impose on its population often has relatively little to do with rates of actual crime and has much more to do with the social, political, and economic context in which imprisonment has been imposed. I think another important thing to note is that in those societies that are the least homogeneous tend to have the highest rates of incarceration. So as much as we want to talk about, you know, celebrating our nation's diversity and diversity being a source of strength, it's also quite clear that where there is a great deal of particularly ethnic and racial diversity and inequality within a country, there are also much higher rates of incarceration. There seems to be an impulse to punish those who are perceived as different or other. And that's true in the United States, but also in other countries around the world. I think the United States experience of incarceration stands out in part because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States, and mass incarceration has been kind of the next front, the next attempt to pose a caste-like system on the African American population here. But you see the impulse to punish those who appear different, whether immigrants or racially different in other countries as well.
And it is an industry, and it makes a lot of money. And if the beds go empty, the profits drop. There are trade shows in America, and I urge any of you who can gain access to go to one of them. and you'll see the array of products that are on display for sale for prisons, everything from toilets to sheets to clothing to shoes, cutlery, you know, whatever is safe, billy clubs, uniforms, all kinds of lockdown systems. They have advertising budgets. They market to wardens and to prisons. And my question about that industry and its growth and its profit goes to John about Ireland. Do you, I mean, I guess we can blame the British for that too if we want, but, or at least for these elaborate weddings they keep funding, but maybe you could talk about what forces are at work in Ireland that raised the number of prisoners so dramatically in the time that you were there.
Yeah, I think around the world, my knowledge around the world is every country that I know of in Europe, particularly, going the same direction. It's all going the direction of locking up more people, tougher and tougher prison sentences, and tougher prison regimes. For instance, in the 1800s, the British, to be fair to them, introduced a law and put it into law that every person in prison should have a single cell unless they were suicidal and needed triple cells for protection. And the Irish government about 5 or 6 years ago actually raised that law and authorised the doubling up of people, which is now widespread. Now I would say that that is the most retrograde step of all. If I was in prison tomorrow morning, the one thing I long for more than anything else is to have my own space. Privacy, protection, and just the space to be a human being. We all need our own space, and not to have your own space is a huge invasion of your privacy. So doubling up became a huge issue in Ireland, in Irish prisons. We're building new prisons, and we're automatically doubling them up, even though the cells are only designed for one person. And even in the women's prison, where we were creating a bit of a revolution in terms of the structure of the prisons, they were designed very much for what I use the word normalization, to try to normalize life inside as much as you could. We deliberately built the rooms in 1999 so small that they couldn't be doubled up, but they have doubled them up.
Now in American prisons, in the federal prison, they're tripled up in that same size space. So I think we are leading that as well in the United States.
And I just think to make the point as well that the regimes in prisons have also gone backwards, because where you had 100 people, you had some effort around regime, but the regime, because of the numbers, obviously suffered as well. So you have huge idleness, for instance, and huge periods of lock-up, where in Ireland, where many prisoners spend 23 hours a day locked up, and that was 30 years ago, that was unknown. So a lot of things have gone backwards. It comes back to the political thing. 10 years ago, we had a party that are no longer in government, but they almost won the election on the slogan, "Zero tolerance around crime." And where did they pick that up from? You all have an idea. And it worked. Now the guy that put it together and promoted it became Minister for Justice, never actually implemented it, but it was the slogan, "Zero tolerance of crime." And I suppose that's the sort of our rot and our cosmetic, our stuff that sells with the public and consequently. So my summary of it is we have gone backwards at rapid rates in Ireland. Our system is gone more inhumane, and has been mentioned already, where a system becomes inhumane, everybody suffers. And don't forget that the staff working in the place are the first sufferers, because if they become inhumane, you can imagine what the ripples are. When they go home, what are they like? When they live in their own communities, what are they like? So inhumanity is contagious and is very, very damaging for everybody. The more inhumanity, the more destructive the regime is. And if you are a prisoner in that regime, you are going to suffer. You're going to be damaged, and you're going to come out of prison far more damaged than you ever were going into prison. And that, I suppose, is the best summary.
In the United States, we eliminated the Pell Grants for prisoners in the 1990s, and one of the big catalysts for that change was the dissatisfaction from the correction officers and the people who earn their living in the prisons, and they're like, I come in and work at this horrible environment every day, and that person is getting an education. And so rather than eliminate the education, many on our committee wonder why we can't have some kind of sort of I don't know, I call it the GI Bill for people who work in the prisons, that they too can access education because they're simply as trapped by the system as the people who are incarcerated often, with very little choice in their own lives. Now, Michelle spoke about the difficulty of coming out of prison and trying to reintegrate into society. And Susan, you have done that. And I know you're not African American, and that was the population Michelle was speaking about, but I think if you illustrate what you went through, that can carry forward to show how difficult it can be. Can you talk about that, like what you went through when you came out?
Yes, I can, but I'd like to just also point out in terms of your first question that the international law, the world law, human rights law, is not applied in any way, shape, or form to the whole systems of incarceration. And that's just an important thing since we're talking about, we have representatives here, and it's a global system that we're looking at when we talk about incarceration. There are particulars, and this country is, I think, leading in the process of incarceration. But the question of human rights, I kept a copy of the International Declaration of Human Rights in my cell. I tried to keep that with me in every prison that I was in because I knew that somewhere in the world there was a more enlightened vision about what incarceration should be and what were my rights as a human being to have in that situation. And I think part of what's really important to say to a group like this is that this system goes on in everybody's name. And that it goes on in the name of protecting all of us, the citizens. I know what it's like to experience a civil death, and I think that's what felons experience in this world. You know, if you're lucky enough to come out, you are civilly dead, and you have to. It's very difficult to reclaim that and to gain back your life. I read this recently, and it kind of shocked me so that in the state of California, and I don't know, you can probably confirm this, 95% recidivism rate of people in California. And that's just an incredible number if you think about that. So I think that's part of coming out. I think the whole system is set up for failure, and that's part of what it means that there's this whole system of mass incarceration, is that a certain number of people need to be incarcerated for the whole thing to work. And coming out is really very difficult. When I came out, I had no papers, I had no identity, but I came out and I was so much luckier than so many people because I was white and because I had been middle class. And so I went back into a situation where there were resources that were available to me, and I was able to utilize that. But that is so not the case with the majority of people that are coming out of US prisons. I think the federal, the state and local laws about drug ex-felons, where people can live, the fact that people have their children removed from them and can't get them back, the fact that we think that we believe in rehabilitation as a system and as a society, and yet there is everything about prison that cuts people off from any piece of their life in the past before they've been incarcerated. So I don't think there's a bleak enough way to paint this picture, actually, which is a terrible thing to have to say, but I think is really true.
Thank you. Shahrnush, a few years ago I spoke to an African poet who was in exile from his country. And I asked him how he felt about that, how he felt about living away from what he grew up with, and did he miss it? And he took a deep breath. He didn't want to answer the question because to admit that he longed for something might be causing him pain, but he finally said he missed the geography of his country, and he missed certain bushes and trees that he could no longer see. Could you answer the question, what do you miss about Iran, if anything, in your exile?
personally, I am a very internationalist. It's not important for me where I live because United States or Europe or Asia, Africa can be my country. It's not important. I miss a lot of people of Iran. You know, the climate is not very important because everywhere you can find oxygen and water, and this is the basic of the world life. And here I can't. I have no idea that I am a stranger. I like the people, and I think the people like me. But I miss my family and my friends a lot, and I wish that they would be very happy.
Thank you. Thank you. One last thing I want to say that was introduced today as a topic, which was a revelation for me, and then we'll open it to questions. But we talked about, or John hit on the topic of education. And we at Penn ran a post-release program for a few years. And I would hire people to teach people who had just come out of prison. And the hope was that if we could get their level of skill up, that the recidivism rate would go down. And one of the things, I, for a while, was invited to appear on a lot of arts panels, you know, as someone who worked with prison and the arts. And then I stopped being invited because I would tell this story. But I think it's important to share with you today, since the topic of education was stressed so forcefully. But I had a wonderful teacher, a poet, who came into the classroom, and she gave everything to these students, brought them donuts, and gave of herself as if she had cut a vein. And she said, you know, write a list of what you want to do with your life now going forward, and what do you want to accomplish before you die. And of course they were teenagers, so they kind of liked that gruesome thought. And they made a list of all the things, and then they read them to each other, and they, you know, it was like, want to be on Oprah, want to have a CD, want to have, you know, the bling bling was a word that was in use then, so that was mentioned. And they left the room with great energy, patting each other on the back. And I sat there watching this thinking, we're failing them, because they already knew how to do that when they walked into this classroom. And we hadn't given them anything. We gave them artistic expression and a forum for that, and that's no small thing. But we hadn't given them skill. We hadn't, and without the skill, that's the legitimate form of power. And writing, I want to wrap up with this, to say this about what we do at Penn. Writing is a skill that can be practiced. And it's a generative skill in that it generates other skills the more you do it. And anything you do with skill allows you to move more freely through the world. And finally, skill is a legitimate form of power. It might be the only legitimate form of power. I'm still thinking about that. But anyway, let's turn up the lights or whatever it is we do here and get some questions. Yes, right there. Oh, I'm sorry, there are microphones going around. I was supposed to say that.
Michelle, to the best of your knowledge, at what point, you spoke about the disproportionate rate of incarceration for blacks versus whites, especially for drug offenders. And I'm wondering at what point does white privilege kick in for white offenders? Is it that they're not being arrested, that they're not being charged, prosecuted, convicted? Are they more likely to be paroled? Usually, where does this process end for white offenders?
Where does it end?
The process of punishment, at what point are we getting off the hook?
Yes, I see. Well, you know, it's really kind of at every stage of the criminal justice process, of course, beginning with who is viewed and kind of interpreted, understood as being a criminal. So that happens on an individual level, and then it happens on a community level. So who's viewed as a criminal when there's a young kid walking down the street, you know, with his friends, who's viewed by the police officer as, oh, we need to jump out, question him about who he is, who his friends are, see if we can search him. You know, the Supreme Court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures as long as they get quote-unquote consent, which means that it's now lawful for the police to stop and search just about anyone, anywhere, as long as they get consent. And what's consent? When a police officer, you know, says with his one hand on his gun, son, you turn around and you put your hands up so we can search you, and he says, yeah. That's consent. The Fourth Amendment no longer applies to that interaction. So when police view, a young black kid as a potential criminal or somebody who looks like a drug dealer and stops, interrogates, and searches him, but the thought would never even cross their mind when seeing a young white kid in his suburban neighborhood or any other, walking down the street. But it also applies to entire neighborhoods and communities. So that the types of tactics that are routine in the drug war in poor communities of color, fanning out into neighborhoods, housing projects, stopping, searching, one car after another, tossing kids on their way home off the subway, sweeping schools, that applies to whole communities and neighborhoods, but just doesn't ever touch middle-class white communities. I mean, how often do you hear about drug sweeps of fraternity houses? You can find drugs there if anybody bothered to go looking for drugs. If you start sweeping fraternity houses, college dorm rooms the way they do inner city, communities and projects, you would turn up plenty of drugs and illegal drug activity. And if you started paying college students to snitch on each other about who has drugs and who doesn't, you'd get plenty of white drug dealers as well. So it operates both on kind of who's perceived as criminal, looks like a criminal, and what communities are deemed appropriate for that kind of drug activity. But the privilege operates at every stage of the criminal justice process. Studies shows that, even once someone's been arrested, a white person is far less likely to actually do prison time for the identical crime, even given identical criminal history. And then once you're released from prison, although white folks who have criminal records face significant discrimination for the rest of their lives, it's of a different quality. Very often, white folks are able to kind of pass by not checking the box on employment applications, and no one thinks, oh, we better run a background check. But it's far more difficult for African Americans to pass by failing to check the box on housing applications or employment applications, and so their criminal history will follow them to their grave in a way that often doesn't exist for whites.
Tactics, it's a great word. Yes, right here.
Hi, Michelle. I have a follow-up question for you. Do you think there is a deliberate link between stop and search policies and gentrification in places like Harlem and Brooklyn and Washington, D.C., and these areas that are, black communities that were chocolate cities that are rapidly becoming less black?
Yes, well, I know that, there's been a lot of controversy about the tactics of the New York Police Department, stopping and frisking African American men in particular, even though marijuana has been decriminalized in New York. If you show it in public, then you can be arrested, and so police trick folks into emptying their pocket by asking them to take what's in their pocket, out in a police encounter, and then use, the little bit of marijuana or whatever is found on them as a justification for arrest. And that's widespread in New York City, and I think that in New York, as well as in a number of cities around the country, there is a fair amount of evidence to suggest that when there's a desire to gentrify an area, to kind of crack down on the undesirables in an effort to discourage them from residing there, or at least being viewed there, to make it a community that isn't perceived as being safe, to be out on the street, out and about, and to more or less kind of run folks out of town. And I do think that does happen. I wouldn't say that it's the official policy of the NYPD, but Charles Blow ran an article a while ago, or an op-ed, where he argued that the police tactics by the NYPD were, forcing African Americans or inspiring African Americans to flee, much in the way that, African Americans had the great black migration fleeing Jim Crow in the South and moved the North, that the tactics of the police here in New York were encouraging black folks to flee as well. And I don't think that knowledge would necessarily deter the police from engaging in those practices when many of the business interests, et cetera, have no problem with, black migration out of the city and view it as in their economic interests.
Right in the plaid shirt. Yes, you.
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of what Susan said, I too am a formerly incarcerated person. I'm coming out of the closet. So, Michelle, you mentioned a mass movement is what it takes to push it forward. I'd like to extend this to my sister from Iran. do you think we're pissed off enough for a mass movement in America? And I say that also because our nonprofit friends of this work don't hire us enough, don't come to us enough for our expertise. I have a brother who is a formerly incarcerated man who has a law degree in North Carolina, and he is very succinct in saying that he understands the issues three-dimensionally. One, he's got the data, the numbers, the reports, just like any other nerdy person that went to college. Two, an on-the-ground organizer who understands the issues in his community and doing the work with the people on a day-to-day basis. And three, the experience, as Susan pointed out very well in her book, of the real inhumanities that are being done unto us. And I can tell you that we're pissed off. But until our allies, and many of who are in this room, and thank you for being as such, until our allies are similarly pissed in the way that we've seen across the Middle East, do we have a chance at a real mass movement? And do you think, in what you've seen in America, do you think that we have the fire inside to really unleash something? I'm sorry if I was a little bit fast.
I can't really answer you because I'm not very familiar with the situation in the United States. I know that Michelle has reason, and the majority of the prisoners are the people of color. And so perhaps the Americans must think about this reality that all the people, color or white, doesn't matter. They are human beings, and they have a reason to live, and they are not criminal naturally, you know. They are not, fundamentally they are not criminal, you know. This is the main reason, and it's very important that the way that the Americans live or exercise their experience against the prisoner, because you are around the world. You are in Iraq, you are in Afghanistan, you are in Africa, you are everywhere. I must tell we are, because I am American also. So if you be cruel, your cruelty reflects to all the countries and all the people of the world. You are the master now. You are the first one in the world. So your act is very important, and the Americans are responsible for this act. If I answered your question, I'm not sure.
Another question? Yes, here in front.
I'm not a felon, but I definitely should be, by virtue of the criminal conduct that I've gotten away with as a person of privilege. That allowed me to become a lawyer. Now I'm a lawyer for people primarily on death row. I write appeals in Louisiana. One of the things that came up recently is that I tried to send a number of books to a prisoner at the Orleans Parish Prison. And I sent a range of books thinking that some of them might be censored. So some were provocative, but others were pretty standard. And they were all returned, all of the books. And what became clear to me is that there was a no books policy. Not like a no controversial books policy, but a no books policy. So for the 3,500 people who live at the Orleans Parish Prison, there's none of the opportunities that were, I guess John mentioned, and that I believe to be some of the opportunities, you know, this captive population of people. It's really an opportunity, or could be an opportunity, but instead it's not. And
that's a change I've seen also since we've done the prison running program. We used to send dictionaries, we used to send all kinds of books to people, and we can't do it anymore. They come back. Occasionally, the prisoner will allow books from Amazon to come in.
They won't even.
Which, you know, why them? I don't know. But
I guess my question is that in a context like that, where there's at least lip service paid to rehabilitation or the idea of rehabilitation. That when you look at it from a penological perspective, or if you look at it from a management perspective, is there any way, John, to convince the jailers that there's actually an interest, that they have a legitimate interest in providing prisoners access to materials that might benefit them. Is there any getting through to these people in your experience?
I suppose my experience is that over the years, prison systems around the world, including Ireland, and I know in America, they have become constipated with security. Honestly. And that is the justification for everything. Everything I tried to do eventually was not eventually because security. They might do something, or they mightn't. When in fact, if you have hundreds of prisoners doing nothing all day, there's far greater likelihood that they'll be on drugs if they can get them, to fill for the boredom, than if they were occupied doing something positive. And that's a control factor, and just don't ever forget that it's a control factor. Security or running a prison, for instance, I can think of very few places where human beings have greater control over their fellow human beings. They can almost do anything in the name of security. And I suppose just responding to your point, I'd say, what is the public opinion side on this? If you ask the public, what support would anybody who's trying to bring about a change, what support would they get from the public? In Ireland, nil. A few individuals, but collectively, as a people, if I promote something like that, like access to education, why I'm so strong in education is not just about skilling, because that is one part of it. The biggest plus of all is self-confidence. If people begin to believe in themselves, then there's no limit to their potential. And low self-esteem is probably one of the greatest curses that befall prison communities. They have no self-esteem, they have very low self-esteem, and they haven't any belief in themselves. And that's why the creative arts are so wonderfully potential, because it's not the skills alone that they learn, but they believe in themselves they learn as a result of being able to do something. And then they say, well, if I can do that, I can go on and do something else. So control is a huge issue. It's always given the justification for it is security. It's rubbish. But the reality is that it has taken over the world over, and it has destroyed all the positive elements that were in prison. And now most prison regimes around the world are very negatively driven. So we're getting rid of all the positives, and we're replacing them with security procedures. And that means no to everything. And that's where the revolution must start, and must start by saying security, fine, you have to have some security, but you must have some control over security, and reading and education and activity and skills are all part of rehabilitation if you're interested in rehabilitation. My final point would be that I can find no evidence in any prison system, there are a few, maybe the Scandinavian countries and maybe the Norwegian countries, but other than those, no evidence that rehabilitation has any significance or any priority, good, bad or indifferent, within the regime.
I just want to second that there is no rehabilitation, that this is an American, and I think it's a global myth, that our system is in any way designed for people to improve or to be responsible or to take accountability for whatever their actions have been. And it's hard to understand that, because this is something we've all grown up thinking, that we are good and that we believe in justice and that we want justice and that this is a way that justice can be achieved. But really the reality is that the prison officials and the structures know that recidivism would go down an incredible amount if they had college in prisons. This is not something new. There's study after study after study. So the question is, knowing that all of that is true, why can't that happen? Because there is another agenda at work and at issue about what's really going on in certainly in American prisons.
One of the great tragedies of being a moderator is that I see a sea of hands. I'm dying to hear the questions, but we have run out of time, and we maybe have time for one more question. You have had your hand up so long. I want to hear from you.
First of all, I want to thank everyone, all of you guys who just made some really touchy, hearing your words, every one of you. But I'm actually reading Michelle Alexander's book, and my comments are directed to her. I want to say this book is phenomenal. It's meticulous. It's great. I got this book from a federal judge who thought it was very provocative, who I work for. Yet we go to court and we still sentence crack offenses disproportionately to people who are using cocaine. You go to the West Coast, people are getting significant time for marijuana. We live in a city here that is supposed to be progressive, yet Emperor Bloomberg has somehow attacked more black men in this city than Giuliani and David Dinkins combined. And the search and seizure thing, that's completely illegal. Spending way lots of money on stopping black men who have weed in their pocket in their socks to say it's out of clean air. My question to you is this, and perhaps your book gets to this because I'm just reading it, so I haven't really gotten into it. I want to talk to you about change and what you think those processes are in light of what I think it's not just a race problem, it's a real class problem. I think that I want to hear you talk about how the black middle class is sort of leaving the black underclass behind and what we can do to sort of, I don't know, because when Jim Crow was around, it was all the black people, right, before we were colored. I don't know if you get to this in your book, but I really want to hear your thoughts about this because...
Michelle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, it's an excellent question, and I do get to it, so keep reading. But you know, there's two parts of it. One is you're absolutely right that you know there is a big divide within the black community, and there is a segment of the black community that is fairly well protected from this new caste system. Not as protected as many of them think they are, which is why when Henry Louis Gates gets arrested in his own home, he thinks to himself, what is happening? This isn't supposed to happen to me, you know? And so there's often shock and outrage when the tactics that are routine and normal, you know, in the hood or in poor communities of color, you know, cross over and begin to affect people of color who think that they've bought their way out of the system in some way. And you know, one of the reasons I wrote the book in the way that I did and framed it as the new Jim Crow is to place the mass incarceration of people of color within the context of a broader struggle of, you know, racial justice, so that people of color who view themselves as not having a stake in this will understand that, you know, their ancestors, you know, fought for and died for racial liberation, and they can't sit quietly by enjoying their relative privilege while, you know, millions of poor folks of color cycle in and out of prison, and to try to inspire a sense of commitment to finishing the, or, you know, to the unfinished business of the civil rights movement and the abolitionists before them. But, you know, I do want to say on the point of what do we do, is that, you know, again, going back to the movement question, people who believe that we can tinker with this system and engage in piecemeal policy reform and have any hope of ending the system as we know it, I think are just sorely misguided. If we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities that are already quite economically vulnerable, and many of those communities have been sold on prisons as offering, you know, far more benefits than they actually do. But nonetheless, those prisons across America would have to close down. You know, private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange would be forced to watch their profits just vanish. You know, this system just isn't going down without a major fight, a radical shift, a major upheaval in our public consciousness. And so how does this begin? Well, I think we have to get beyond, you know, where civil rights organizations have been for the last 30 years, which is, you know, arguing about whether individual isolated policies are right or wrong, whether the crack versus powder cocaine disparity should be 100 to 1, 50 to 1, 18 to 1. We need to get away from just piecemeal policy reform, although reform is important, you know, getting away to limiting ourselves to piecemeal policy reform and saying out loud, this system of mass incarceration has got to come to an end. And we need to start questioning drug prohibition. The idea that, you know, it makes sense for us to be putting people in cages and relegating them to a permanent second-class status for life because they were once caught with some drugs. You know, we've spent $1 trillion on a drug war, and rates of drug abuse and drug addiction are largely unchanged. So we've got to begin asking the bigger questions, because we've been losing the forest for the trees, you know, trying to deal with these, you know, isolated policies, and not saying we need to end this system as we know it and build a human rights movement for education, not incarceration, and jobs, not things.
I'm told we have time for one more question. Yes. Is there a microphone here? Can we do that?
I'm wondering if there could be a silver lining to the budget crisis, and that because we're facing all of our states and our federal government are in such trouble, that might change our prison policy. Because as we know, it's incredibly, incredibly expensive. I mean, there was a map of Brooklyn real estate, and some of the worst neighborhoods, the slum neighborhoods in the city, were deemed the most expensive because they had the highest rates of incarceration, and that's so expensive per prisoner. So do you think money, you know, the God of America, might ultimately give us the change we're seeking?
Well, thank you. That was a perfect follow-up to the last question. You know, and I think that the answer is that the economic crisis facing states, large and small, is going to result in modest reductions in the size of our prison population. But I don't believe we're going to get anywhere close to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s. A time, by the way, when many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high. But I don't think we're going to get back to the bad old days that we had in the 1970s without a major upheaval. Because as I said, there are so many interests invested in the system of mass incarceration. You know, 1 million jobs depend on it. You know, big money is made off of this system. So it's not going to just vanish because of the economic crisis. More likely there will be some modest downsizing, and we will reach a new plateau, which will be unconscionable. It'll be an unconscionable plateau, but we will tell ourselves, oh, you know, our rates of incarceration have come down. Things are better now, when they're still 2, 3, 4 times what they were in the 1970s. So I don't think there's any way around it. And also, once we reach that plateau, it'll start to become very unpopular again for politicians to be viewed as soft and crime, and all of the racially charged imagery and, you know, the pathologization of the urban poor will kick up again in the media, and all the racial stereotypes that were used to justify the war on drugs and the emergence of mass incarceration will kick up again if we haven't actually changed our underlying attitudes about poor people of color and developed a more compassionate response to the struggles of folks in those communities.
John, did you want to? I just want to respond one way in relation to, is there any evidence that economics alone will solve the problem? And there's no evidence. The only evidence I have is that the conditions for people in prison will worsen and worsen and worsen. My other concern would be, and it's happening in Ireland all the time, is that when we improve standards for one category, that higher standard then becomes an issue because people say, why are they so well treated? And what happens? The lowest common denominator becomes the norm. In other words, we can't have women living in one prison in a single room while they're sharing cells in another room, so everybody shares cells. So and the final point I make on that was, years ago in Ireland, women who were sentenced to what was called penal servitude, which was a substitute for transportation, used to get 1/3 remission. A man brought an action to the High Court and won it on discrimination. But what did the authorities do? Eliminate 1/3 remission and apply a 1/4 remission to everybody. So there's no evidence that economics alone will solve anything. Matter of fact, I'd be worried that conditions will worsen rather than, and that it's the prisoner who will suffer rather than the other way around.
We keep getting reprieves with these notes, so we have time for one more question. Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you so much. This is not for Mr. Arland or Ms. Ibran, but for the United States, we spend anywhere across the country from $4,000 to about $15,000, $16,000 a year to educate a child. We spend $100,000 to $200,000 a year to incarcerate someone. What if we reversed it?
Eddie Jones, you look like you know how to do that.
I wanted to suggest that I used to.
Can we get a microphone too?
Loud voice.
It's being recorded that we need you to talk because of the recording.
Oh, I see.
I worked for many years at the women's prison at Bedford Hills, and after 9/11, I was thrown out. I think.
Did you have something to do with that? Or?
No, a lot of my students had been labeled former terrorists, and so they couldn't find space for me. But I'm asked all the time by students that I meet, many other people, how I would like to work in a prison. I would like to help people enhance their self-esteem. I would so like to be able to do something about this other than creating a mass movement, which we would all dream about. But what would any of you suggest that I tell these people who are of good faith and would like to, and then they knock at the door and the door says, you can't get in? What do we do? I mean, are we faced with this is impossibility?
No, I don't think so. People have asked me that question also now all the time, and it's, I wrote a book, so I don't have every answer. But I think that there are parts of movements that are emerging where things are going through a change. There is some response. There are organizations. There are specific political struggles and social struggles. I agree with Michelle that it's to think that we can piecemeal this in some way and fundamentally alter it is an error. I don't believe that that's possible. And nobody here has mentioned the concept of abolition in terms of prison abolition, but it's something also to think about, and I would just throw it out for people to learn more about
Susan,
it.
can you just define what you mean by prison abolition?
Ending prisons. Forget about reforming prisons. Let's get rid of prisons and let's figure out the big answers to the big questions about what happens to people and the social and political and racial and economic conditions that exist. By the fact that when do ex-felons stop paying our debt to society? Do we ever end that debt? There are people here who are doing work in all different ways around criminal justice, the condition of women in prison. I think there's not an absence of a lot of things that people can do, and the fact that this is a filled room, I've been doing and talking about pen and prison writing for years, and I've never been in this large a group. So I think that there is something that we can tell people, and I'm not a huge optimist, but I'm a little bit of an optimist that there are these things that are beginning to emerge.
If I can just follow up on that, because I think that's absolutely right, and I worry sometimes that when we talk about social movements, people get kind of overwhelmed, like, I want to build a social movement. Well, what possible role could I have in that? I myself, as an individual, can't launch a social movement. That seems pie in the sky. I think it's important to keep in mind that there are social movements that are underway in the United States today. There's, a gay rights movement. There's a green movement. There's movements that, don't conform to our idea of, necessarily, the civil rights movement, I think, tends to dominate people's ideas about what a movement ought to look like or how it ought to inform or how it ought to form. And certainly there is a role for us taking to the streets. There is absolutely a role for that. But the planting the seeds of the movement is as important right now as anything else. And each one of us can take responsibility for raising consciousness among those around us, whether you're in a school, whatever kind of community they're in, if you're in a faith community, taking responsibility for raising consciousness, beginning the dialogue, educating those, and organizing around the issues that you are passionate about. A lot of times people say, I can't get into a prison. Well, what about all the people who are out of prison and who need help, who can't find work, can't get housing, who need direct assistance? There's ways in which you can serve them. And organizations like the Fortune Society here in New York and others, where you could go and provide direct assistance to people on the outside, because odds are they won't be out for long. And if you can help to ensure that they have their basic needs met, you may well be saving a life. And so I think that there's many ways to just, amplify what Susan, many ways in which we can contribute to a movement and help to plant the seeds of a broader movement, and we can't get too overwhelmed.
That's a great place to stop with that idea. And if you want to, enact some social change right now, you can use your money wisely and well and go out and buy some of the books. We have books from our 4 panelists for sale. And also, if any of you have means to help fund the prison writing program, we are in need of funds, so you can step forward and help with that as well. Thank our panelists, please, for a fantastic afternoon. Please.